The quiet morning on Earth was shattered by the sound of distant rumblings, barely noticeable at first. People walked down busy streets, talking, laughing, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. It was a peaceful day, until everything changed in an instant. Without warning, the sky darkened. The air grew thick with an unnatural hum. Then came the explosions. The first wave of alien ships dropped from the sky, their sleek metallic hulls reflecting the sunlight for a brief moment before they unleashed their devastating payload. Cities, once full of life and hope, were suddenly reduced to nothing but smoke, rubble, and dust. Buildings crumbled as shockwaves sent cars tumbling into each other. The sound of the blasts was deafening, drowning out the screams of people who barely had time to react. There was no warning, no negotiation, just destruction, pure and brutal. The world's defenses were overwhelmed in minutes. Earth's military forces scrambled to respond, but it was clear they were outmatched. Radar systems picked up more ships coming from the heavens, their numbers growing by the second. The invaders were relentless, bombarding major cities across the globe with their advanced weaponry. In New York, the iconic skyline fell like a house of cards. In Paris, the Eiffel Tower collapsed with a deafening roar. No place was safe, no place was untouched. People ran for cover, but there was nowhere to hide. From the crumbling ruins of the world's capitals, a chilling message echoed across every screen. The alien invaders were not here to negotiate. They weren't interested in diplomacy or peaceful coexistence. They were here for one reason only: to conquer. Their leader's voice came through, cold and emotionless, as it cut through the chaos. This is your final warning, Earth. You will surrender, or face the extinction of your species. We have destroyed your cities. Your defenses are nothing against us. Your future is in our hands now. The leader's voice was followed by images of the devastation they had caused. Fires burning across the world, the remains of once proud nations smoldering in the wake of the invaders' assault. The footage was unrelenting, the visual reminder of humanity's helplessness. Panic spread like wildfire, with governments crumbling under the pressure. There was no plan. There was no backup. The very idea of Earth standing up to these alien forces seemed like a distant, impossible dream. General Thomas Hayes watched the broadcast in horror. He stood with his team in the underground command center, surrounded by monitors flashing red, showing the devastation of every major city. The weight of the moment settled heavily on him. He had seen wars, battles, and losses, but this was something else. This was total annihilation. As a soldier, he had been trained to fight, to protect, to defend. But this was not a war. It was a slaughter. "General," one of his officers said, breaking the silence, "what are our orders?" Hayes stared at the screen, his jaw clenched tightly. The world outside had been brought to its knees, and his heart ached for the lives lost. But even in this darkest hour, one thought burned in his mind: revenge. The aliens had killed millions, destroyed homes, families, entire cultures, and now they would pay for it. "There are no more orders," Hayes said, his voice low, heavy with grief and fury. "We fight back, whatever it takes." The room was silent for a moment, and then a low murmur spread among the soldiers. They were with him. They understood. There was no turning back now. On the other side of the world, in the midst of the chaos, a group of survivors, led by a scientist, Dr. Evelyn McCade, was desperately trying to find a way to fight back. Her research lab had been destroyed in the first wave, but she had been working on a secret weapon, a last-ditch effort that could potentially turn the tide of the war. The details were classified, but Dr. McCade had always believed that humanity had the potential to do more than just survive. If they could just survive long enough, they might stand a chance. The weapon she had been working on, called the Excalibur Project, was the product of years of research into alien technology and Earth's own cutting-edge weaponry. The Excalibur was meant to disrupt the energy systems of alien ships, disabling their shields, their weapons, everything. But it wasn't ready. It was incomplete, and its chances of success were slim. Still, Dr. McCade knew that the only way they could survive now was to try. "We have no choice," she said, gathering the remaining scientists around her in the ruins of the lab. "If this works, it could disable their entire fleet. If it fails—" She let the silence speak for itself. There was no more time to think, no more time for planning. The aliens weren't waiting. Dr. McCade and her team worked tirelessly through the night, preparing the Excalibur for launch. But they weren't sure if they would be able to complete the weapon in time. The clock was ticking, and the alien forces were getting closer. The war had begun, and the fate of humanity hung in the balance. As the night stretched on, Hayes and his soldiers watched from the command center. The general had always believed in humanity's ability to fight back. But now, with everything hanging by a thread, he could only hope that the Excalibur would be ready in time. In the distance, the alien ships continued their assault, their weapons pulsing with deadly energy. They were coming closer. They were going to destroy Earth. But Hayes' resolve was firm. Earth's defenders might be outgunned, but they weren't outmatched. They weren't finished yet. This was just the beginning. And the aliens had no idea what humanity was capable of. The world was a broken shell of what it once was. The cities that had stood as symbols of human achievement were now nothing more than piles of rubble, burned and scarred beyond recognition. In the wake of the alien assault, Earth's remaining governments had fractured, leaving small, isolated groups of survivors scattered across the planet. But they weren't defeated. Not yet. General Thomas Hayes stood in the midst of the chaos, his eyes fixed on the holographic map projected in front of him. It showed what little was left of the world's military forces, retreating from the alien onslaught. But there was something else on the map too, something important. The location of the Excalibur project. Dr. Evelyn McCade's weapon was their last hope. It had to be. The general knew they were running out of time. The alien fleet hovered over the planet like a looming shadow, their ships massive and imposing. Each passing day, they drew closer to wiping out humanity entirely. It was clear now that Earth's forces were no match for their superior technology and ruthless tactics. Humanity had been too proud, too arrogant, to prepare for such an invasion. But now, there was no choice but to fight back with everything they had. The Excalibur project wasn't just a weapon. It was the key to turning the tide of this war. But it wasn't ready. It had been under development for years, a last-ditch effort to protect Earth in case of an extraterrestrial threat. Dr. McCade had always believed that humanity's resilience could win out in the end. But this was different. The alien invaders had already killed millions, and now they were just waiting for humanity to crumble completely. The Excalibur was their last hope. "I'm not waiting for another hit," Hayes muttered to himself, pacing in the dimly lit command center. He couldn't afford to lose any more time. The Excalibur had to be activated, even if they didn't have all the pieces in place. They were running out of resources, running out of manpower. But the general wasn't about to give up. "Prepare the fleet," Hayes ordered, his voice steely with determination. "We're going in. We'll fight back with everything we've got." The plan was simple, or at least it seemed simple. With the last remnants of Earth's military, they would strike at the heart of the alien fleet. The mission was suicidal, but at this point, they had no other option. There was no time to waste on hesitation. Earth's last defense was the Excalibur, and they had to make sure it would work. Dr. McCade's team worked around the clock, installing the final components of the weapon, their faces drawn with exhaustion. They had no illusions about what was at stake. The Excalibur was their only shot at survival. If it failed, humanity was done for. And if it succeeded, they would have one chance to strike back at the invaders. But time was running out. The countdown had begun, and they were still only halfway through activating the weapon. As the last wires were connected and the weapon hummed to life, Dr. McCade's voice trembled with a mix of fear and excitement. "This is it," she whispered. "We're ready." But the uncertainty in her voice was clear. They didn't know if it would work. The power needed to disable an entire alien fleet was unimaginable. Would the Excalibur be strong enough to pierce through the invaders' impenetrable shields? Would it stop them in their tracks? Or would it fail, just like every other desperate measure they had tried in the past? On the surface, Earth was a battleground. The remnants of human civilization were now fighting for survival. But it wasn't just the military forces left on the front lines. Ordinary people had become soldiers too. People who had once lived normal lives. Teachers, farmers, factory workers were now thrust into a fight for their lives. Some fought with weapons they had no business handling, while others worked behind the scenes, trying to keep humanity's last hopes alive. Hayes had seen it all. The devastation, the loss, the terror. But now, as he watched the alien fleet move into position, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. For the first time since the invasion began, there was a chance. They had a weapon. They had a plan. And they were ready to make the aliens pay for every life they had taken. The Excalibur hummed louder now, its energy building. Dr. McCade's eyes gleamed with the knowledge that her creation could either save or destroy them all. She knew the risks, but she was too far gone to stop now. Humanity's fate was in her hands. As the alien ships loomed closer, General Hayes gathered his soldiers. There was no turning back now. The final battle had begun, and no matter the outcome, Earth's people would fight with everything they had. They would show the invaders what it truly meant to provoke humanity. "Let's finish this," Hayes said, his voice steady, his resolve clear. "For Earth, for every life lost, for our future." The screen flickered as the Excalibur's final preparations were made. The weapon was ready. All that was left was to fire it. But would it work? Would it be enough to turn the tide in their favor? The tension in the air was palpable. The moment had arrived. Outside, the alien fleet moved closer. The countdown had begun. The fate of Earth rested on the shoulders of a few brave souls, and no one knew if they would live to see another day. The world was holding its breath. The alien ships loomed over Earth like an unstoppable storm, their weapons pulsing with deadly energy. The Excalibur project was humanity's last hope. Everything depended on its success, but the risks were unimaginable. Dr. Evelyn McCade stood at the controls, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the final countdown on the monitor. The weapon was ready to fire, but there were so many unknowns. Could it disable the alien fleet, or would it fail just like everything else had? She couldn't afford to think about failure. Not now. Not after all they had been through. Humanity's survival depended on this moment, and she knew they couldn't waste any more time. "We have one shot at this," she muttered under her breath, her fingers hovering over the activation button. The countdown continued, the seconds ticking down like an eternity. "Are you sure it's going to work?" one of the engineers asked, his voice shaky with uncertainty. "I don't know," Dr. McCade answered honestly. "But if we don't try, we're all dead anyway." Outside, the alien fleet continued its relentless advance, moving closer to the Earth's surface. The massive ships blocked out the sun, casting everything below in shadow. Their presence was suffocating. General Hayes watched from the command center, his eyes narrowing as the alien fleet seemed to stretch on forever. It was like they were all waiting for something, waiting for humanity to give in. But they were wrong. They didn't know what humanity was capable of. They hadn't learned that lesson yet. "General," one of his officers said, looking up from the monitors, "we've got incoming fire. They're targeting us." Hayes looked at the screen and saw the alien weapons charging up. There was no time to waste. "Dr. McCade, you have to fire now," he said, his voice tight. "They're almost here." Dr. McCade didn't hesitate. She slammed her hand down on the activation button. The Excalibur hummed to life. A massive beam of light shot up from Earth's surface, tearing through the atmosphere and streaking into the sky. The energy blast hit the nearest alien ship with a tremendous explosion, sending shockwaves rippling through the alien fleet. The ship shuddered violently, its shields flickering before they collapsed completely. The vessel was dead in the air, disabled. For the first time, humanity had struck back. But the victory was short-lived. The beam had only disabled one ship. The rest of the fleet was still coming. "Keep firing," Dr. McCade shouted, frantically adjusting the settings. She knew they couldn't stop until every ship was disabled. Every single one. The weapon was powerful, but the alien fleet was enormous, and they had to work fast. Another blast shot from the Excalibur, but this time the alien ships adapted. Their shields flared up again, absorbing the energy and deflecting it. The fleet had been hit, but they weren't out of the fight yet. The overwhelming power of the enemy's weaponry was closing in fast. General Hayes clenched his jaw as he watched the second wave of alien firepower approach. He knew they couldn't withstand much more. The moment of hope brought by the Excalibur had quickly faded. The aliens were regrouping, preparing for a counterattack. There was no room for error now. "Ready the ground forces," Hayes ordered, his voice cold and determined. "We need to buy them more time." His soldiers moved quickly into action, preparing for the inevitable ground assault. The alien ships, though temporarily disabled, were still hovering overhead, and it wouldn't be long before they started deploying their forces to finish what they had started. But General Hayes wasn't about to give up. He wasn't going to let Earth die without one last fight. Dr. McCade was already back at her station, frantically working to adjust the Excalibur's energy output. "It's not enough," she muttered under her breath, adjusting the settings as fast as her fingers could fly across the controls. "We need more power." "There's no more power left to give," one of the technicians shouted, panic in his voice. "We have to get it to work." Dr. McCade snapped, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Do you think I don't know that?" She was losing her patience. They were running out of options. Humanity had one chance to survive, and it was slipping away from their grasp. Meanwhile, outside the command center, chaos was breaking out. The alien forces had begun their assault on Earth's remaining military bases. Ground forces were engaged in desperate firefights, but they were vastly outmatched. The alien soldiers were fast, powerful, and had advanced weaponry beyond anything humans had ever seen. It was like fighting a shadow. The fighting was brutal. Soldiers, once filled with confidence, were now overwhelmed and retreating. And yet they kept fighting, because they had no other choice. In the midst of it all, General Hayes was getting the reports of the alien advances, but his eyes never left the monitor that showed the status of the Excalibur weapon. If they didn't stop the aliens now, they'd never get another chance. The countdown was still running, but the weapon's energy readings were unstable. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. It wasn't just a matter of saving Earth anymore. It was about protecting everything they had ever known. "General, we have one more shot at this," Dr. McCade said, her voice shaky but resolute. "We have to put everything we've got into this last strike." "Do it," Hayes said, his voice like steel. With a final push, Dr. McCade entered the last of the commands. The Excalibur flared with energy, brighter than ever before. And as the beam shot into the sky, this time it wasn't just one ship that went dark. The blast hit multiple vessels, one after another, with devastating precision. Alien ships began falling from the sky, their engines fried, their shields shattered. Earth had struck back harder than anyone had ever expected. The tide was beginning to turn. But even as humanity celebrated this unexpected victory, the battle was far from over. The war was only beginning, and the aliens would come back with vengeance. But for now, for the first time in months, there was hope. And that was something humanity hadn't had in a long time. The Excalibur's beam cut through the alien fleet like a knife through butter, and for a fleeting moment, humanity dared to believe they had a chance. The massive ships, once looming in the sky with their deathly presence, began to fall one by one, their energy shields crackling and finally giving way to the might of the Excalibur. It wasn't enough to destroy them all, but it was a victory, a temporary one. Yet in the aftermath of that brief triumph, the war was far from over. General Hayes stood on the command platform, eyes fixed on the screen as the remnants of the alien fleet regrouped. The victory had been hard-won, but it was clear that the battle was far from finished. The alien commanders were not the types to back down easily. They had underestimated humanity once, and now they would make sure they would never do so again. "They're regrouping," Hayes said, his voice taut with a combination of frustration and determination. "They're not retreating. They're adapting. We've only slowed them down." Across the command center, a low murmur spread through the remaining officers and soldiers. Hope had been ignited, but the fire was small, flickering, and not enough to win the war just yet. The battle had shifted from one of overwhelming force to one of survival. Earth's forces had struck a blow, but the aliens were far from beaten, and in the distance, the shadows of new alien ships emerged. Reinforcements were on their way. Their numbers were almost infinite. "We need to move," Hayes snapped. "Prepare all remaining forces. This is our only chance to press the advantage." Dr. McCabe stood in the corner of the room, her mind racing. The Excalibur had done more than anyone had expected, but the energy was not unlimited. The weapon had a finite capacity, and they were dangerously close to exhausting it. If they couldn't disable the rest of the fleet before it powered down, humanity's last hope would turn into nothing more than a pile of melted metal. She clenched her fists and stared at the glowing data on the screen. "We need to buy more time," she said, looking up from her console. "I need more power, or we're finished. The weapon can only sustain so many shots." "Do whatever you need to do," Hayes said, urgency lacing his words. "But make it fast. Those reinforcements won't give us any more time." Dr. McCade's mind worked quickly. There was no more time to waste. The power grid they had been using to charge the Excalibur was already stretched to its limits, and every shot drained more from Earth's already decimated infrastructure. But there was one other option. An experimental energy converter, a piece of technology that had been in development for years but was untested. If they activated it, they could possibly tap into the Earth's remaining core energy, amplifying the Excalibur's output for one more devastating strike. But it was a long shot. If the converter malfunctioned, the resulting explosion could wipe out everything in the surrounding area. There was no other choice. "Activate the energy converter," Dr. McCade ordered. "I'm going to send everything through it." "Are you sure about this?" an engineer asked, his voice trembling. "If it fails, we cooled." "We don't have time for hesitation," Dr. McCade snapped. "Just do it." The engineers scrambled to work, setting up the converter's energy nodes and aligning them with the Excalibur's systems. The room hummed with the low buzz of machinery, the tension rising as they connected the last wires. Dr. McCade's hands were shaking, but her mind was sharp, focused entirely on the task at hand. She knew this was it. They either turned the tide with this last shot, or humanity would be reduced to a footnote in the galaxy's history. Outside, the alien fleet hovered like vultures, preparing for their next wave of attacks. Their ships had suffered damage, but they were still a terrifying sight. The weapons of the invaders were like nothing humanity had ever encountered. Their ships could vaporize entire cities with a single blast, and their soldiers were ruthlessly efficient. The war had pushed humanity to the brink of extinction, but they still had a spark left. That spark was the Excalibur, and with the energy converter, it could burn brighter than ever before. "Ready," the technician called out, his voice steady despite the looming danger. "We've connected it. Power levels are increasing." Dr. McCade gave a sharp nod. "Then let's do this." She pressed the activation button once again. The Excalibur thrummed with energy, and this time, the entire room seemed to shake with the sheer force of the power coursing through it. The first beam shot into the sky, larger and more intense than ever before. It streaked through the atmosphere and collided with the alien fleet in a flash of blinding light. The explosion was unlike anything the world had ever seen. This time, the alien ships didn't just falter. They were torn apart. The blast sent shockwaves through space, disintegrating ships in its wake. The energy pulse from the Excalibur, now amplified by the energy converter, obliterated everything in its path. It was as if a great force of nature had ripped through the alien armada, and for the first time since the invasion began, the invaders were on the defensive. But just as humanity felt the first taste of victory, something unexpected happened. A secondary wave of ships appeared, larger than any the Earth had seen. Their technology was more advanced, their shields far stronger. The battle was far from over. "They've got reinforcements," Dr. McCade said, her voice barely audible. The smile on her face quickly faded as the realization hit. Humanity's victory was only temporary. The war had escalated once again. General Hayes, though, didn't falter. He turned to his commanders with a hard look in his eyes. "Prepare for another wave. We're not finished yet." The fight for Earth was now a battle of attrition. Humanity had dealt a devastating blow to the invaders, but the stakes had been raised. Earth's future was still in the balance, and now the final showdown had begun. Would humanity stand tall, or would the aliens wipe them from the stars forever? The situation had grown even more dire than before. The battlefield in the sky had turned into a hellish landscape of fire and destruction. Earth's forces had managed to disable a significant portion of the alien fleet with the combined power of the Excalibur and the energy converter, but now the true extent of the enemy's power was becoming apparent. The reinforcements that had arrived were unlike anything humanity had faced. These new ships were massive, bigger, faster, and far more advanced than the original fleet. The war had shifted from a battle for survival to a battle for extinction. General Hayes stood before his command center's main screen, watching the incoming alien ships with a mixture of resolve and dread. The monitors flashed with data, shield levels low, weapon systems strained, enemy force overwhelming. Every part of the system screamed for help. The Earth's military was stretched to its breaking point. Even with the success of the Excalibur weapon, they were now being outnumbered at an alarming rate. "We need to regroup," Hayes said, his voice steady but tight with the knowledge that they might not make it through this. "Pull the ground forces back. We're going to have to make a stand here." The officer next to him looked at the screen, eyes wide. "General, there's no way we can hold them. The reinforcements are." "I know," Hayes interrupted, "but we're not going down without a fight." The officer swallowed and nodded, a look of reluctant understanding passing over his face. He didn't need to hear any more. The general had made his decision. Dr. McCade was at her station, furiously working to optimize the Excalibur system. She had no time for doubt. The alien reinforcements were overwhelming, but if they could manage to fire the Excalibur one more time, if they could overload its systems once again, they might just stand a chance. But the odds were slim. The converter's power had almost burned out. The weapon's energy reserves were critically low, and the alien ships were already closing in. "We need more power," Dr. McCade muttered to herself. I can't do it with this much." Her hands trembled over the controls as she glanced back at the battlefield on the monitor. The Excalibur's energy signature had started to flicker. The weapon was on its last legs. But Dr. McCade's mind was sharp. There was one last option. If they could tap into Earth's core once more, they might have enough energy for one final shot. It was a dangerous gamble, one that could fry the weapon systems entirely and leave the planet defenseless. But she had no other choice. There was no time left. "We need more power," she said again, this time to the engineers around her. "Find a way to divert all remaining energy to the weapon." "Are you out of your mind?" one of the engineers asked, his face pale. "If we do that, we'll overload the entire grid. Earth cold." "I don't care," Dr. McCade snapped. "If we don't, we're all dead anyway." The room fell silent. The engineer's face reflected the fear that everyone in the room was feeling, but there was no other choice. The ground forces were retreating, and even now, the first of the alien troops were beginning to land on Earth's surface. Humanity's last stand was in the sky, but it was also on the ground. The battle had become a race against time. With a deep breath, Dr. McCade turned back to the main control panel. Do it. The power surge was immediate. The hum of the Excalibur grew louder, a deep rumble vibrating through the floor. Outside, the first alien ships began their descent, massive craft falling toward the Earth with terrifying speed. They were like dark shadows blotting out the sun. The alien soldiers began to disembark, their armored feet hitting the Earth's surface as the ground trembled beneath them. "They're here," a soldier whispered, his voice full of disbelief. "The invasion has started." And just like that, humanity's battle for survival moved from the skies to the streets. The war on Earth was no longer just about fighting off an alien invasion. It was about preventing the total collapse of everything they had fought to protect. Back in the command center, the Excalibur was reaching critical levels. The screen flashed red. The weapon was ready, but its power could only last for so long. "One shot," Dr. McCade whispered, her fingers flying across the keys. "We get one shot at this." "Do it," General Hayes ordered, his voice a calm center amid the chaos. The final shot was humanity's last hope. This wasn't just about destroying the alien ships. It was about sending a message. Humanity would not go quietly into the night. The beam shot from the Excalibur, bursting from Earth's surface with a force that shook the ground itself. It was a white-hot blast of energy, brighter than anything the world had ever witnessed. The beam hit the first wave of alien ships, disintegrating them in a flash of blinding light. It was as if the very fabric of space itself had torn open. The energy was more concentrated than ever, and for a moment, it seemed like the aliens' entire fleet might fall. But then the secondary wave of ships, even more formidable than the first, unleashed their counterattack. It wasn't over. The shockwave from the Excalibur had created a brief lull in the alien offensive, but now the enemy was furious. Their ships came back online, their weapon systems targeting the planet. The countdown for Earth's final moments had begun, and the war had escalated into a deadly final confrontation. On the ground, humanity's soldiers fought with everything they had. Every street corner became a battleground. The alien invaders were unlike anything Earth had faced. Taller, faster, and stronger. Their weapons could cut through human defenses like paper, yet the humans fought on. They had been beaten down, but not broken. They still fought because there was no other choice. But despite their best efforts, the numbers were too much. The aliens were everywhere. The battle was lost, and humanity could only hold on for as long as it could. But as the last remnants of the Excalibur weapon charged for one final, all-out strike, the world knew that humanity's survival, against all odds, was no longer about simply defeating the invaders. It was about learning to stand together when everything else was falling apart. The final moments of the battle were a blur of fire, smoke, and the deafening roar of weapons colliding. Humanity's forces were scattered, pushed back into what little territory remained. Earth's cities lay in ruins, the once thriving hubs of civilization now mere ashes and wreckage beneath the alien invaders' boots. Every human soldier, every officer, every civilian who dared to pick up a weapon had given everything in their power to push back against the alien forces. But it was clear there was no more time. The invaders were everywhere, and Earth was on the brink of annihilation. General Hayes stood on the battlefield, surrounded by the devastation. His face, once a mask of unshakable resolve, now carried the weight of all the lives lost in the struggle. Around him, soldiers fought with every ounce of their strength, but they were outnumbered. The aliens had brought their full force to bear, and Earth's defenses, though heroic, could not stand forever. The war had begun with a clear objective: push the aliens back and protect Earth. But now it had become a fight for survival, simply trying to outlast the inevitable. The survivors were scattered, hiding in underground bunkers, trying to buy time. There was no coordinated front anymore. The fight was individual, desperate, and personal. Some clung to hope, but even those who had once believed in victory were now questioning if survival itself was possible. In the command center, Dr. McCade had given up hope of a miracle. The Excalibur's energy reserves were all but depleted, and the power grid that had once fueled Earth's final weapon had long since collapsed. There was nothing left. The energy converter had been pushed beyond its limits, and the weapon itself was now little more than a glowing, useless husk. Her fingers trembled as she ran diagnostics on the system one last time. The numbers that flashed on the screen were all wrong, the power levels unstable. "We're out of time," she said quietly, as if speaking to herself more than anyone else. "We've failed. The aliens are too strong." But as Dr. McCade looked up from the screen, she saw something. A shadow. No, a flash of movement. A sudden explosion of energy from deep within the remnants of the Excalibur system. She blinked in confusion, her heart skipping a beat. Could it be? Was the weapon still functioning? She quickly worked the controls, pulling up the data feeds. Her eyes widened in disbelief as she saw the impossible. The Excalibur was starting to charge again, but this time, it wasn't drawing from the Earth's power grid. No, something else had activated it. The power signature wasn't from their systems. It was coming from a new source. A new source. A terrifying thought crossed her mind. Could it be the aliens had a hidden asset of their own? Something even more powerful than what they had seen. "General," Dr. McCade shouted as she ran to the front of the command center. "The Excalibur. It's coming back online." Hayes turned to her sharply, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What do you mean? We've used everything. There's no way we could." "Look here," she interrupted, pointing to the screen where the weapon's energy levels were steadily climbing. "It's coming from deep within the core of the planet, General. Something triggered it, something I didn't account for. It's not just the converter. The Earth's core. It's giving us power." The implications of her words hit like a tidal wave. In all their planning, they had failed to consider the possibility that Earth itself might still have some reserve of energy hidden beneath their feet. Humanity had been using up their resources, desperate to fuel their weapons, but the Earth itself was a dormant powerhouse, one that they had only begun to tap into. It was a new hope, a last-ditch shot at survival. "Activate everything," Hayes commanded. "We're not letting this opportunity slip through our fingers." The Excalibur began to hum with renewed life. The machine was no longer just a weapon. It was now a symbol of humanity's final stand, a representation of the raw power of a dying world fighting against impossible odds. The alien reinforcements were still descending, still targeting humanity's cities, still wiping out their last bastions of resistance. But now, there was something different in the air, a quiet force, a shift in momentum. The tide might be about to turn. "Prepare for the final strike," General Hayes said, his voice calm but laced with urgency. He turned to Dr. McCade, his face a study in grim determination. "We can do this, Doctor. We have one shot left." The war had been long and brutal. Earth had bled. Humanity had lost friends, family, and entire generations. Cities were gone. The Earth itself had been scared beyond recognition. And yet, amid the devastation, humanity was still standing. The Excalibur was their weapon, their lifeline. It had been their hope from the beginning. And now, with the unexpected power surge, it had become their final chance for victory. With the last of their strength, humanity focused everything on one final attack. The Excalibur's charging systems flared to life, the weapon now powerful enough to obliterate even the alien reinforcements. The air crackled with energy, the pulse building, growing, until the weapon reached its peak. Hayes took one last breath, then nodded. Fire. The beam shot from the Excalibur, more powerful than anything ever seen before. It tore through the sky, shattering the alien ships in an instant. The energy surged outward, expanding to engulf everything in its path. The shockwave was so intense that it lit up the night sky, bright enough to be seen from space. For a moment, everything was still. The air was thick with the weight of the explosion. And then, as the smoke cleared, humanity dared to hope. The alien fleet was gone. The invaders had been decimated. But the cost had been immense. The Earth had been ravaged, and humanity's future was uncertain. Yet they had won. Against all odds, they had driven the invaders back. The war had ended, but the scars it left behind would take generations to heal. As the dust settled, General Hayes stood tall amidst the ruins. The war had been brutal, but humanity had survived. And perhaps in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.